Hi guys, before we start chapter number 4, let's read section 2, Livelihoods, Economies and Societies. In section 2, we will shift our focus on the study of livelihoods and economies. We will look at how the lives of forest dwellers, pastoralists, and peasants changed in the modern world and how they played a part in shaping these changes. All too often, in looking at the emergence of the modern world, we only focus on factories and cities, on the industrial and agricultural sectors which supply the market. But we forget that there are other economies outside these sectors, other people too, who matter to the nation. To modern eyes, the lives of pastoralists and forest dwellers, the shifting cultivators and food gatherers often seem to be stuck in the past. It is as if their lives are not important when we study the emergence of the contemporary world. The chapters in section 2 will suggest that we need to know about their lives, see how they organize their world, and operate their economies. These communities are very much part of the modern world we live in today. They are not simply survivors from a bygone era. Chapter 4 will take you into the forest and tell you about the variety of ways the forests were used by communities living within them. It will show how in the 19th century the growth of industries and urban centers, ships and railways created a new demand on the forest for timber and other forest products. New demands led to new rules of forest use, new ways of organizing the forest. You will see how colonial control was established over the forest, how forest areas were mapped, trees were classified, and plantations were developed. All these developments affected the lives of those local communities who used forest resources. They were forced to operate within new systems and reorganize their lives, but they also rebelled against the rules and persuaded the state to change its policies. The chapter will give you an idea of the history of such developments in India and Indonesia. Chapter 5 will track the movements of the pastoralists in the mountains and deserts, in the plains and plateaus of India and Africa. Pastoral communities in both these areas form an important segment of the population, yet we rarely study their lives. Their histories do not enter the pages of textbooks. Chapter 5 will show how their lives were affected by the controls established over the forest, the expansion of agriculture, and the decline of grazing fields. It will tell you about the patterns of their movements, their relationships to other communities, and the way they adjust to changing situations. In chapter 6, we will read about the changes in the lives of peasants and farmers. We will discuss the developments in India, England, and the USA. Over the last 2 centuries, there have been major changes in the way agriculture is organized. New technology and new demands. Okay, new technology and new demands, new rules and laws, new ideas of property have radically changed the rural world. The growth of capitalism and colonialism have altered rural lives. Chapter 6 will introduce you to these changes and show how different groups of people, the poor and rich, men and women, adults and children, were affected in different ways. We cannot understand the making of the contemporary world unless we begin to see the changes in the lives of diverse communities and people. We also cannot understand the problems of modernization unless we look at its impact on the environment. So we need to look what are the impacts on the environment by the modernization. So now let's start chapter number 4, that is forest society and colonialism. Take a quick look around your school and home and identify all the things that come from forest. The paper in the book you're reading, desk and tables, doors and windows, the dyes that color your clothes, spices in your food, the cellophane wrapper of your toffee. The dyes that color your clothes, spices in your food, the cellophane wrapper of your toffee, tend to live in biddies, gum, honey, coffee, tea, and rubber. Do not miss out the oil in chocolates, which comes from sal seeds. The tannin used to convert skins and hides into leather, or the herbs and roots used for medicinal purposes. Forests also provide bamboo, wood for fuel, grass, charcoal, packaging, fruits, flowers, animals, birds, and many other things. In the Amazon forest or in the Western Ghats, it is possible to find as many as 500 different plant species in one forest patch. A lot of this diversity is fast disappearing. Between 1700 and 1995, the period of industrialization, 13.9 million square kilometer of forest, or 9.3% of the world's total area, was cleared for industrial uses, for cultivation, for pastures, and fuel wood. Here's a figure. A sal forest in Chhattisgarh. Look at the different heights of the trees and plants in this picture and the variety of species. This is a dense forest, so very little sunlight falls on the forest floor. 1. Why deforestation? The disappearance of forest is referred to as deforestation. So the disappearance of forest is referred to as deforestation. Deforestation is not a recent problem. The process began many centuries ago, but under colonial rule it became more systematic and extensive. Let us look at some of the causes of deforestation in India. 1.1 Land to be improved. In 1600, approximately one-sixth of India's landmass was under cultivation. Now that figure has gone up to about half. As population increased over the centuries and the demand for food went up, peasants extended the boundaries. So here are the reasons about the spread of deforestation. Um, the first one would be the demand for as the population increased over the centuries, the demand for food went up. Peasants extended the boundaries of cultivation, clearing forest and breaking new land. In the colonial period, cultivation expanded rapidly for a variety of reasons. First, the British directly encouraged the British encouraged the production of commercial crops like jute, sugar, wheat, and cotton. The demand for these crops increased in 19th century Europe, where food grains were needed to feed the growing urban population and raw materials were required for industrial use. So, we have a figure here, figure 2, When the Valleys Were Full, painted by John Dawson. Native Americans, like the Lakota tribe who lived in the great North American plains, had a diversified economy. They cultivated maize, foraged for wild plants, and hunted bison. Keeping vast areas open for the bison to range in was seen by the English settlers as wasteful. So for the English people, they thought it was wasteful. After the 1860s, the bisons were killed in large numbers. So they were killed in large numbers. We have source A. The idea that cultivated land had to be taken over and improved was popular with colonizers everywhere in the world. It was an argument that justified conquest. In 1896, the American writer Richard Harding wrote on the Honduras in Central America. There is no more interesting question of the present day than that of what is to be done with the world's land which is lying unimproved. Whether it shall go to the great power that is willing to turn it to account, or remain with its original owner who fails to understand its value. The Central Americans are like a gang of semi-barbarians in a beautifully furnished house, of which they can understand neither its possibilities of comfort nor its use. 3 years later, the American-owned United Fruit Company was founded and grew bananas on an industrial scale in Central America. The company acquired such power over the governments of these countries that they came to be known as banana republics. Box 1. The absence of cultivation in a place does not mean the land was uninhabited. In Australia, when the white settlers landed, they claimed that the continent was empty or terra nullius. In fact, they were guided through the landscape by aboriginal tracks. So they were guided in the landscape or through the landscape by aboriginal tracks and led by aboriginal guides. The different aboriginal communities in Australia had clearly demarcated categories. The Gurungeri people of Australia plotted their land along the symbolic body of the first ancestor, Gurungeri. Gurungeri. This land included 5 different environments. Number 1, salt water. Number 2, riverine tracts. Number 3, lakes. Number 4, bush and desert plains. Okay, number 4, bush. Number 5, it would be desert plains, which satisfied different socio-economic needs. Okay, so now let's come to the causes of deforestation. Second is, in the early 19th century, the colonial state thought that forests were unproductive. So the colonial people, they thought that the forests were unproductive. They were considered to be wilderness that had to be brought under cultivation so that the land could yield agricultural products and revenue and enhance the income of the state. So between 1880 and 1920, cultivated area rose by 6.7 million hectares. We always see the expansion of cultivation as a sign of progress, but we should not forget that for land to be brought under the plough, forests have to be cleared. 1.2, Slippers on the tracks. So we have some new words. Slippers. They are the wooden planks laid across railway tracks. They hold the tracks in position. Figure 3. Converting sal logs into slippers in the Singhbum forest in Chota Nagpur, May 1897. Adivasis were hired by the forest department to cut trees and make smooth planks, which would serve as sleepers for the railways. At the same time, they were not allowed to cut these trees to build their own houses, so the trees were only kept for the use by the colonial masters. By the early 19th century, oak forests in England were disappearing. This created a problem of timber. So, the oak forests were disappearing in England, and this created a problem of timber supply for the Royal Navy. How could English ships be built without a regular supply of strong and durable timber? How could imperial power be protected and maintained without ships? By the 1820s, search parties were sent to explore the forest resources of India. Within a decade, trees were being felled on a massive scale, and vast quantities of timber were being exported from India. The spread of railways from the 1850s created a new demand. So the Britishers, they needed timber to build ships for the navy, and the second requirement would be for the railways. So the spread of railways from the 1850s created a new demand. Railways were essential for colonial trade and for the movement of imperial troops. To run locomotives, wood was needed as fuel, and to lay railway line sleepers were essential to hold the tracks together. Each mile of railway track required between 1,760 and 2,000 sleepers. From the 1860s, the railway network expanded rapidly. By 1890, about 25,500 kilometers of track had been laid. In 1946, the length of the tracks had increased to over 765,000 kilometers. As the railway tracks spread through India, a larger and larger number of trees were felled. So, development or the growth, it came at a cost. Our trees, they were fallen down or they were cut in large numbers, and the forests were cleared. As early as the 1850s, in the Madras Presidency alone, 35,000 trees were being cut annually for sleepers. The government gave out contracts to individuals to supply the required quantities. These contractors began cutting trees indiscriminately. Forests around the railway tracks fast started disappearing. Figure 4. Bamboo rafts being floated down the Kasalong River, Chittagong Hill tracks. We have another figure, figure 5. Elephants piling squares of timber at a timber yard in Rangoon. In the colonial period, elephants were frequently used to lift heavy timber both in the forest and at the timber yards. Both in the forest and at the timber yards. Source B. The new line to be constructed was the Indus Valley Railway between Multan and Sukkur, a distance of nearly 300 miles. At a rate of 2,000 slippers per mile, this would require 600,000 slippers, 10 feet by 10 inches by 5 inches, or 3.5 cubic feet apiece, being upwards of 2 million cubic feet. The locomotives would use wood fuel at the rate of 1 train daily either way and at 1 mond per train mile, and annual supply of 219,000 monds would be demanded. In addition, a large supply of fuel for brick burning would be required. So it would be number 1 for the sleepers, the timber and wood would be required. Next one is as fuel, and the third one would be for fuel in the brick burning, or the brick making industries. The slippers would have to come mainly from the Sindh forest, the fuel from the tamarisk and jant forests of Sindh and the Punjab. The other new line was the Northern State Railway from Lahore to Multan. It was estimated that 2,200,000 slippers 2,200,000 slippers would be required for its construction. It was estimated that 2.2 million slippers would be required for its construction. We have a figure. Figure 6. Women returning home after collecting fuel wood. Then figure 7. Truck carrying logs. When the forest department decided to take up an area for logging, one of the first things it did was to build wide roads so that trucks could enter. Compare this to the forest tracks along which people walk to collect fuel wood and other minor forest produce. Many such trucks of wood go from forest areas to big cities. 1.3 Plantations. Large areas of natural forest were also cleared to make way for tea, coffee, and rubber plantations to meet Europe's growing need for these commodities. The colonial government took over the forest and gave vast areas to European planters at cheap rates. These areas were enclosed and cleared of forests and planted with tea or coffee. We have a figure. Figure 8. Pleasure brand tea. So this is an advertisement of tea. 2. The rise of commercial forestry. In the previous section, in the previous section, we have seen that the British needed forest in order to build ships and railways. The British were worried that the use of forest by local people and the reckless felling of trees by traders would destroy forest. So they decided to invite a German expert, Dietrich Brandis. So they invited a German expert for advice and made him the first Inspector General of Forest in India. Brandis realized that a proper system had to be introduced to manage the forest, and people had to be trained in the science of conservation. This system would need legal sanctions. Rules about the use of forest resources had to be framed. Felling of trees and grazing had to be restricted so that forest could be preserved for timber production. Anybody who cut trees without following the system had to be punished. Okay. So they have to follow the rules strictly. We have a figure here, figure 9, one aisle of a managed poplar forest in Tuscany, Italy. Poplar forests are good mainly for timber. They are not used for leaves, fruit, or other products. Look at the straight lines of trees, all of a uniform height. This is the model that scientific forestry has promoted. And we have another figure, figure 10, a deodar plantation in Kangra, 1933, from Indian forest records. And we have another figure, figure 11, the Imperial Forest School, Dehradun, India, the first forestry school to be inaugurated. So this is the first forestry school to be inaugurated in the British Empire. It's called the Imperial Forest School, which is in Dehradun in India. So Brandis set up the Indian Forest Service. So it's the Brandis who established or who set up the Indian Forest Service in 1864 and helped formulate the Indian Forest Act of 1865. So he set up the Indian Forest Service in 1864 and formulate the Indian Forest Act in 1865. The Imperial Forest Research Institute, an institution which is called as the Imperial Forest Research Institute, was set up at Dehradun in 1906. The system they taught here was called scientific forestry. Many people now, including ecologists, feel that this system is not scientific at all. In scientific forestry, natural forest, which had lots of different types of trees, were cut down in their place. So what happens in scientific forestry is that in the natural forest, which had lots of different types of trees, they were cut down first. And in their place, one type of tree was planted in straight rows, like what we saw in the Italy. Just like that, we have to plant them in straight rows, and this is what we call as plantation. Forest officials surveyed the forest. So forest officials, they were also posted there in the forest. Forest officials surveyed the forest, estimated the area under different types of trees, and made working plans for forest management. They planned how much of the plantation area to cut every year. The area cut was then to be planted so that it was ready to be cut again in some years. So there was a replantation process also. After the Forest Act was enacted in 1865, it was amended twice. So it was amended once in 1878 and then next in 1927. The 1878 Act, it divided forest into three categories. The first one is reserved, second, protected, third, village forest. The best forests were called reserved forest. Villages could not take anything from these forests, even for their own use. For house building or fuel, they could take wood from protected or village forest. So that's all guys. See you in my next video. Bye.